Hi, everybody. My name is Urban Martin, and I'm the director of the Ground Truth track at BSides Las Vegas. Andy Applebaum and Ron Alford are doing our next talk called Revenge on the Worms Towards Deception Against Automated Adversaries. Andy Applebaum is a security researcher at MITRE. He works on applied and theoretical security research problems and is one of the leads on the Caldera Automated Adversary Emulation project. He has a growing interest in the ability of attackers to both misuse and thwart machine learning and artificial intelligence systems. Ron Alford is an AI researcher specializing in automated planning at MITRE. His interests include theoretical foundations of automated planning and developing new algorithms for autonomous cyber operations and response. If you have questions, you can submit them to the live QA via Discord, and that QA session will immediately follow the talk. So without any further delay, please enjoy the talk and submit some questions. Thanks.
Hey everybody, my name is Andy Applebaum, and I'm here to talk to you today about our work called Revenge on the Worms Towards Deception Against Automated Adversaries. As a quick intro, I'm a security researcher at the MITRE Corporation, where I work on projects like, kind of working with the attack framework, also with Caldera. I'm here with my colleague Ron Alford. Ron, if you want to take a quick second to introduce yourself.
Yep, I'm Ron Alford. I'm also working at MITRE. I work on automated planning with robots, with cybersecurity, wherever I can figure out where to fit it in.
Thanks, Ron. So to kind of just dive right into it, or really just kick off this talk, there's been a lot of papers and blog posts and articles in the past 5 to 10 years that talk about the potential malicious use of AI and machine learning. And here's one from 2018 where they survey the landscape of potential security threats from the malicious uses of AI. And one of the things they find is that the use of AI to automate tasks involved in carrying out cyber attacks will alleviate the existing trade-off between the scale and efficacy of attacks, really saying that using AI will be good for potentially attackers. And this has gone on a lot. Even more recently than 2018, there was a paper from the NSCAI in 2021 that kind of reported similar things, where they looked on, hey, what's going on with AI? And they said AI is deepening the threat posed by cyber attacks. And they outline a lot of different ways that AI can be used for nefarious means, including cyber, right? They list, really one of their big categories is accelerated cyber attacks. They talk about self-replicating AI-generated malware, rapid machine-to-machine escalation by automated C2. There's a lot in there, and there seems to be other reports, other blog posts that talk about this, like potential for big change that AI and machine learning can have on, kind of how cyber attacks are conducted. And this has also been seen in the security community. There are a lot of papers, blog posts, open source tools that use, AI or machine learning in some way to conduct cyber attacks more effectively, be it, using machine learning for social media scraping and phishing, using GANs to generate malware, generating C2 domains using GANs. There's lots of these examples out there, and you could fill a whole separate talk on diving through each of these individually. That said, there really aren't a ton of publicly documented examples of adversaries actually leveraging AI or machine learning. Part of that, of course, is whether or not we can observe that, and we would know that we're observing the use of these technologies. But part of that is the question of whether or not adversaries are today using these technologies as part of their attacks. Having said that, given all this forecasting and all the work that's been done in this space, we think that one day there will be attackers using AI and machine learning to make their attacks more effective. And I'm, of course, biased, having worked on the Caldera project. If you haven't seen Caldera, it is open source software that we've put out there to run automated adversary emulation exercises. It runs attacks in real time. It leverages the MITRE attack framework. It has a super low install overhead, and it's heavily customizable. And, Caldera is designed to run these automated red teaming exercises. But of course, as you're using it, it might, you can kind of think about, well, could an adversary use this for nefarious means as well? And talking about why that might matter is that Caldera makes a lot of stuff that a red team would want to do, and maybe even an adversary would want to do. It makes it easy. Number one, Caldera is smart. We use ideas from the automated planning community during action selection. Ron's going to talk a lot more about that, and I will too, kind of further in the talk, kind of diving into what automated planning is. But really, each action has its inputs, its outputs, and its requirements, and that allows Caldera to dynamically compose those actions into larger profiles. Caldera is also fast. If you configure it the right way, it can laterally move through a network at about a host a minute. That's not, blazing speeds, but it's certainly, pretty up there for moving through a network. It's also extensible. It's not just like, well, here's 10 things it can do and that's it and you're done. It's very easy to add new techniques and capabilities and also integrate it with other tools such as Bloodhound. And then, really outside of Caldera making it easy, one of the big things that we note is Caldera is what we know. If what we're doing with Caldera is fast and it's allowing us to do these dynamic capabilities, couldn't an adversary do it as well? And this really raises the question of, well, how do we defend against automated adversaries? And here I put up kind of, just some very basic ideas for, how could we do this using, say the categories in the cybersecurity framework? Do we want to do we identify, what's running on our network and better catalog, capabilities? And that's always helpful, but it's not necessarily the answer to defend against an automated adversary. Do we protect our networks, hardening things, making sure, all of our protections are out there, mitigations, things like that. And that's always helpful, but, you don't always protect all the things. That's why there's things like detection. But when we think about detecting an automated adversary, well, if we're compromising a hosts at 1 per minute, it might be hard for us to have our manual processes in the SOC actually pick up on what an automated adversary is doing. So that might not be the best option. Response is a great idea, but we can't always respond if we don't detect, if we're too slow there. And then recovery is not an option either, just because if we're just lagging behind the adversary, then they're making tons of progress. So, really, what do we do? And, to kind of answer that, we're going to walk through a simple example. The lead is buried. We do want to talk about deception. So what we do want to say, let's use deception. But before getting there, here's a simple example of a screenshot of, a network topology, given out by a Bloodhound. And it's relatively straightforward. An attacker can start over here with Alice's credentials, and they want to get over to the domain controller, and they can leverage this structure over here to get down to client 2 over there using the Alice account. From client 2, they're able to get access to Bob's account because he has a session there. Bob is a member of this domain admins group, and that's an admin to this host over here. And so now the adversary can get a foothold over there, and from there they can get at the domain controllers group. And there are, in fact, automated tools that are able to do this. There's a couple up there, Death Star, Angry Puppy, Go Fetch, that are able to automatically execute these paths from Bloodhound. Now, let's look at it again and say, what would happen if we threw in, say, deception in here? And the idea is we can insert like a fake edge that says, well, this support group down here is an admin to this win box over here. It's a fake thing in there. We've thrown it into AD, and we're just going to see what happens. And now an automated adversary might come in, see they're a member of this group, see it's an admin on that box, and try to laterally move, but that won't work, of course, because it is a fake rule that we put in. And so what happens? Well, if it's a simple adversary, they might just break. They'll just keep trying to laterally move using Alice over and over and over again, and you've won. The adversary is not getting through. And even if the adversary is smart and they recognize that this isn't working, or they even recognize the deception, you've now made it harder for them to run their operation and easier to detect them. And so with that said, our thought and our objective here, both with this talk and this kind of broader context Ron and I are working in, is we want to understand how to best deceive or disrupt the planning process of an autonomous agent, particularly in the cyber domain. Part of this is to formalize deception, more on that academic side, to also help grow the community of researchers considering this topic, and also to start thinking about how to build capabilities that can anticipate future automated threats. And one of the big things, too, that we want to look at is how do we add deceptions to our environment to make them particularly challenging for an automated adversary? Is that different than what we'd want to do for a human? So this talk is, just being very upfront. It's fairly academic. We're presenting primarily preliminary work we've done in simulations. We've done a little bit with Caldera, but really the bulk of the talk today is on that preliminary work run in the simulation space. Our goal, though, is really to help inspire others to at least start thinking, hey, how should we defend against automated adversaries? We think that this might be a problem in the future, and if we can help inspire others to think about it, we think that'll be a big win. And so our agenda is, I'm going to hand it off to Ron in just a second, who's going to talk about some of the background and related research. Then we'll talk about some of these preliminary experiments we ran, what the context was, what the results were, and then dial back for future work and some conclusions and takeaways. So with that said, I will hand it over to Ron to talk more about the background for what we're looking into.
Thank you, Andy. Then first, we're going to start off with just thinking about what it means to be acting in a cyber environment. What are the types of things we're worrying about? So, maybe next slide, Andy. Okay. And in the first place, I guess a big disclaimer here: we're definitely not the first people to think about deception in cyber environments. There's lots of people working on deploying honeypots on networks, which are for adversaries to move into, and then we can observe them there and see how they're acting. Decoy file placements, we can monitor file that are touched or accessed or modified, place decoy credentials, and or just network obfuscation so that DDoS attacks don't work as well. And not only that, there's work on putting all these pieces together so you can automate deception operations against an adversary. This is an example of RDS of one toolkit. But these are mostly designed to be deployed against human adversaries that we expect to be coming onto networks. But there's even more advanced stuff coming down the line, especially in the realm of content generation for these networks. You've probably seen these toy domains like I'm not quite sure how we might deploy a fake Airbnb listings to deceive adversaries on the network, or this this monocle guy in the center, but if we can generate believable fake code to put places in our networks, that could keep our adversaries, at least the human adversaries, entertained for a very long time. Will it keep automated worms entertained? Well, probably not. Maybe they'll suck it up. Maybe it's good for that. Okay. So let's think about how an adversary is going to work in an environment. So next slide, Andy. Well, actually, back up maybe a step. So, how does a human work on our network? No, sorry, not you, not you, Andy. Me back up a step, a rhetorical step. So, how do humans behave in the environment? Well, humans are deliberative creatures. We might be a little slow in moving through a network as a red team, but we can be innovative and take steps that that someone else hasn't seen before, and piece together two separate components to have a new effect that we want to on the network. We're great at pattern recognition. We can, if we see a line of hosts, we might be able to match up hosts to users. We might be able to guess passwords in certain cases, especially if you can pull up biographical information on users on a network. And critically, especially compared to computers, our ability to detect anomalies such as hosts that are just really out there for the network that we were expecting, our ability to do that much better than current AI systems. Also, cyber adversaries can get irrationally mad at you. So if you're going around and they get the impression that as a defender you're just kind of making fun of them in the environment by switching things around or by creating deceptions that are just really blatantly obvious, they could just decide to nuke your domain. Well, this is opposed to so if this is a human, what is a computer? Well, obviously, if I made a list, it's the opposite of that list. So computers are very fast at applying actions in the domain, but it's prescribed by what the programmer put into there. pattern recognition is getting better on computers, but anomaly detection stinks. And what a nice thing about especially if you can isolate some cyber adversary software, or you just making some for yourself as a stand-in, is that you can run it over and over on various iterations of a network, and it will never get mad at you. And so this provides an opportunity for testing that we don't have with human red teams. So let's look at the type of environment. Now we can look at the type of environment that a an automated adversary might be working in. And so let's look at a particular scenario. So we have a host that we've infected. It has a remote access tool running on it that can run code for us, and we've identified sensitive information on another host, and we want to exfiltrate that that sensitive data from that secondary host. And to do that, we have a suite of techniques that we can apply, from exploiting a vulnerability in a certain piece of code to remote execution if we've under certain circumstances, dumping credentials, copying files, and finally we have our exfiltration technique. And we want to be able to piece these together, all these separate techniques, into a program or an automated operation to go forward. Well, the first technique that we've seen some in the wild is finite state machines. So a finite state machine is just you've seen this before. We take we have our machine starts at a certain state, looks at the environment, looks at what and it has a prescribed output for a given result from its last action. So there, if we can take our four of our actions, and make a machine out of them. We dump credentials on it. We start off with that dump credentials on a box. We go to mount a file share. After that, we copy a file, remote execution, rinse and repeat over and over until we get to our right box where we can apply our data exfiltration, and then we're done. That's great. We made our tiny, nice little neat machine that's that automatically exfiltrates data from a network, assuming that this is all we need to do it on the network. But what if our networks are more complicated than that, and we need our other set of actions? Well, now we have this finite state machine. Where it's not really clear where these other ones will fit into that. We might have to, maybe they can, there's going to be different paths. There's different ways to weight them, and maybe we want to start to optimize, and this just gets really problematic to just plug this into a state machine. And this is where the field of automated planning has really come. It provides a really tempting tool to apply to the building cyber adversaries, automated cyber adversaries for us to for people to use. So a quick short take on what is automated planning. One is it's a pretty big subfield of AI. It's centered around sequencing actions, and the central philosophy of it is that what the user describes is the physics of a domain. So we describe what actions the user can take, or the agent can take. Sorry, preconditions are what must be true in the world for those actions to be applied. What the effect of those actions is on the world. So not necessarily how it changes the world, but what the world looks like after that action happens, and a goal state of the world that we want to achieve. And the automated planning system is meant to find a sequence of actions that takes us from the initial state to a state of the world in which our goal is true. It's been applied a lot of different places. A kind of famous example here is the Hubble telescope. Hubble telescope gets requests from scientists. Gets way more requests than it could ever take. Number of observations it could ever take. They have to consider constraints on their motion. How much power they can use up. Thermal constraints, whether the Earth is in the way, whether the transit path to the give observation points it at the sun, which would be unfortunate. How far away the angular distance, how long it has to sit there, and then we have to take all those constraints and try to optimize a sequence of observations to take over a given period of time. And so that they're trying to, it's, we have all these different observations, and we want to make the maximum, you have to make the maximum science out of this telescope over a given period of time. So next slide. So how does this look like in the cyber domain? Well, we have our various different actions. So let's look at the copying a file action. What do we need to copy a rat over from host 1 to host 2? Well, we need to have a working remote access tool on host 1. We need to have a mounted file share on host 1 from host 2. We have to have write access to that file share. This is what is called a precondition or a requirement for this action to take place. So this is going back to the automated planning terminology. Okay, so once we execute that copy action, we expect that there'll be a new file on the target host, and it will contain that file will contain the rat. This is an effect or a consequence or post condition. There's a lot of different words about it, but this is what the action makes true in the world afterwards. So if we take a whole bunch of these together, we can try to sequence sequence them to act. So let's look at this copy file. Let's say our goal is to copy a file over. We'll look at the other one shortly. So to copy a file, what it will do is get the file on target, but it needs to have a mounted file share. To get the mounted file share, we do our mount share action, which mounts share but needs credentials. And to get the credentials, we take our credential dumping tool, which gets us the credentials but needs a remote access tool with elevated permissions. And together, these three actions form a plan. And a plan, as long as our initial state of the world is what we think it is, with an elevated remote access tool on a machine that has proper credentials, this plan will get us to our goal state of the world of having a file on the target host. So next slide. So, but in the cyber environment, especially as our domain, our abilities and techniques get more complicated and get more, we just get more of them, we might have more than one plan. So we have this set of hosts, and so dumping credentials and mounting a file share and copying a file is somewhat and maybe analogous to exploiting a vulnerability and running your remote desktop. So we have to be able to sequence you have to not only have to look at as given plan, we might want to have to look at multiple plans. So Andy, next slide. And so here we might have three different plans. They're different lengths. They're different, so they might have different amount of time. We might be worried about different levels of observability from the blue side analytics. Or there just might be different probabilities that this plan will actually work, right? We might have different confidence in each of these plans. And so an automated planning system is able to run through these different these different sets of actions and produce various sets of sequences, sets of plans that it can sort through based on our criteria, pick out and then provide them to us. And so then we can just okay, we can try the best plan. If that fails, we can try the next plan. And so that these automated planning tools give us a way to think about having lots of plans available to us, and how we might prioritize those. So next slide. So just talking about some computational aspect, planning is very, very hard. So from a computational standpoint, at least the worst case complexity, it's p-space complete for propositional planning. If you don't know, that's not that bad. That's not, you don't need to really know those words, but what it means is that we might have to iterate through every possible state of the world that we think we can reach in order to find a plan in the worst possible case. And then if that wasn't the bad enough, different things can make it much worse. So say we don't control the output of our actions. We know that they might fail. They might return different sets of things, or maybe we don't know everything. Maybe there are important things about the domain that we can't see. We only infer by completing multiple actions, or maybe there's another actor in the environment that's working against us, or maybe they're not working against us. Maybe they're working with us, and all these different attributes make planning exponentially harder. Uh, and so they can essentially and some of these can make it just unsolvable. And so a successful application of automated planning in a domain means making a careful use of the features that you care about. So if you can ignore non-determinate actions, if you say, okay, I know this action fails, but I'll just handle it runtime. Okay, if it fails, I'll just ask the planner for a new plan instead of rigorously planning for all outcomes of the plan. That makes it much easier to do. Okay, so next slide. Now, unfortunately, in practice, despite having this terrible worst case complexity, people have found ways to make the problems that we typically look at easy to solve. So every couple of years, there's this big international planning competition with lots of different tools tested on lots of different domain features, on lots of different domain structures, and for the most part, we're able to solve those problems and solve them relatively quickly. And in fact, you can pull down lots of the open source code for it. And plus, cyber planning problems end up being a much simpler structure than what a lot of these planners work on. A lot of what this competition focuses on. So there's plenty of reason to think that we can solve these problems quickly. It's not going to be a computational burden, even though that some of the theory says it might be. So with that, I think I'm going to hand it back to Andy. Oops, sorry, I have one more. Yeah, one more on this. So deception, the existing research on cyber deception has really been focused mostly on people. So it's been taking honeypots, and how do you design a honeypot to fit within a network? How do you distribute them within a network to make sure that they're not they have properties about that match with the hosts around them? And then how, on the inverse side, as an adversary, how do you look at a honeypot or a network obfuscation and say that hey, look, that's fake? How do you detect that? And it goes back and forth in the research. The gap here for looking at automated adversaries, which we think is coming, is that when they do come, they're going to introduce their own attack surface against them, right? Because they're going to have some decision procedure, and that decision procedure and that new that makes them how they choose their actions is going to add some complications. So can we use that against them to slow them down by introducing domain features that distract the decision procedure? Can we make, if they're simple enough, can we get them stuck in loops? Can we make them accomplish our goals by making them trip sensors and analytics as they move through the environment, or can we redirect them over to honeypots where we can safely observe what they're trying to do and their techniques? Now I think I'm handing it back over to Andy.
Thanks, Ron. So yeah, I'm going to dive back into it and talk about some of our experimental results. And the big question here that we're trying to look at is how robust are automated planners to changes in the cyber domain? And of course, the key word there is automated planners. I know Ron has talked a lot about them, but I want to take a second to just quickly describe what an automated planner is. Really, the simplest way to refer to a planner is it's a domain-independent program that takes as input a machine-readable description of actions, a start state, and a goal state, and outputs a sequence of actions to achieve that goal, kind of starting in that initial state. And usually what happens with automated planning is you have this machine-readable format. I'm just going to call it PDDL for now. It's topic for a separate talk. But it allows you to specify, okay, this is my action description. These are the preconditions, the postconditions, the parameters. We refer to this as the domain. You also have a machine-readable description of the environment. We refer to this as the problem. And using those two, the planner is able to come up with a plan that spits out that action sequence that gets you over to the goal that you're looking for. And this is a gross oversimplification, but one of the ways that planners work is they effectively take this machine-readable format and construct a graph from that machine-readable format and then traverse the graph to find the actions to achieve the goal that you're looking for. It's that graph construction that's the real complexity here. Now, of course, that's an oversimplification, and just to make sure no one's walking away too with just that as what planning is. A couple of quick notes. This is an oversimplification. A lot of planners, there's tons of variations in planners, and a lot of it's really on how they ground things and how they search for things. And then lastly, domains and problems are small, but the resulting graphs can be huge. That's probably, one analogy I'd put there is chess. We all know the start state, we know what the end state is, but coming up with the sequence from the start to the end is the big computational question. It's a very large graph. So with that little bit of extra background, our experimental idea is relatively simple. We want to leverage something called the Caldera Enterprise Domain Specification. This is in PDDL, and I'll provide a little bit more detail on that in a couple of slides. Select a specific problem, like a specific enterprise representation, to focus on, and then baseline how long it takes the planner to solve that problem, and then make modifications to that problem, rerunning the planner to measure total computation time. And we want to answer a few different things by doing this. Of course, we do want to kick the tires and just see what happens. It's always fun to do that. But we want to identify, what types of modifications work best to deceive planners. We also want to try to feel out like how much effort we need to put in to make a modification. And I'll give some examples of that one as we go through this. We also want to know whether or not the modifications or the deceptions that we add, whether or not we can make those work against multiple planners, or whether or not, we have one deception for one planner and another deception for another planner. And then another question is, how important is it where we put the modification? This is big. You would think intuitively that if you put the modification in line of where the attack path is, it's most likely to have a bigger impact, but we want to double check and make sure, experimentally. And then lastly is, what's the maximum possible slowdown we can have against a planner? I guess maximum possible is a bit of a lofty goal, but certainly at least to try to understand how much of a slowdown you can get against a planner. Before getting into it, a few disclaimers. First, we are assuming by running this that an adversary is using a domain-independent planner. These planners that we're going to talk about are ones that you can use for what we're doing here, but you can also use them for, say, solving the game of Snake, kind of anything represented in PDDL. So we're making, it's a relatively big assumption, but it is important for us to kind of, really see what the mechanics of what we're looking at is here. We also assume the adversary plans all at once, never updating the plan. In reality, an adversary is going to execute something, get an observation, and then replan. So this isn't necessarily the most realistic, but again, we still want to feel out these waters. And lastly, I would just add, we aren't necessarily deceiving the adversary, but we're modifying the topology. It's a bit of a difference, but it's kind of important as we think about how to deceive. Well, how do we actually modify the topology, right? Because the deceptions are going to modify the topology ultimately. So that said, a few kind of quick details about the Caldera PDDL domain. Basically, it represents a very basic Caldera adversary profile. It scans hosts, it dumps creds, mounts shares, uses remote WMI for lateral movement. This is actually, if you want to go use Caldera and use something representative of this, the adversary profile is Alice 2.0. Should be out there in stockpile. The domain represents a few kind of core objects. You have Windows domains, hosts, and then users with their credentials. And there's about 30 different predicates that describe various features within the environment that we care about. Things like status, what's Caldera's state of compromise, things that just detail like, hey, this host has a host name, and then relationship predicates that say this user is an admin on this host. And what's cool about the Caldera domain is that it's monotonic and delete free, which really here means that adding information does not cause contradictions. So as long as there's a valid attack path in the problem we start with, as long as we're only adding information, we're never going to remove that attack path, and we're never going to cause the domain to be unsolvable. There will always be a solution. And then I'd also just kind of point out that this was used as part of the 2018 International Planning Competition. So this one is also available freely online. And so to give a very rough example of just kind of like what the action flow looks like here, here we have host 1. We're going to discover all hosts as the first command. We're going to see host 2, 3, and 4. We're then going to dump creds on host 1. We're going to get Rick and Rachel because they have active sessions. We're going to probe for admins on host 4. Roy is an admin there. Can't do much with that info. Probe for admins on host 3. We see Rachel's an admin on 3. Since we've got Rachel's creds, we can laterally move over to host 3. We dump creds on 3. We get nothing. We then probe admins on 2. We get Rick and Pris as the admins there. We've got Rick's credentials, so we can laterally move to 2. We dump creds, we get Roy and Wilbur, and using Roy, we get over to host 4. And then there's a couple of other things that, because we're planning here and being a little bit more intelligent, we don't ever say, scan host 1 for admins, just because that piece of information isn't really relevant for us. So with that said, a little bit more about our test setup. We created a set of about 25 different modifications, things like adding fake users, adding fake credentials, fake hosts, things like that. For each trial, we record the total time, the plan length, and some metadata we're not going to get into for this talk. Each trial, or each modification, we run it multiple times to hedge against some potential randomness, because we do make some random decisions. Here, we're just doing 10 trials per modification. We did test it on a variety of Caldera problems. Here, we're just focused on problem number 8. And then we also were able to test on 2 public, fairly high-performing planners called Fast Downward and Probe. And so here are the results. There's nothing there. No, I'm kidding. We're going to walk through each of these kind of quickly, but on the left is the modification, and the middle column is Fast Downward, just the time, the standard deviation across the trials, and the total plan length, or the average plan length, and then the same for Probe. When we talk about unmodified, we can see Fast Downward versus Probe. 67 seconds for Fast Downward. Probe only took 41 seconds. Probe also came up with a length of size 24 versus 26. So Probe here was both faster, fairly significantly faster, and also more efficient. It came up with a better plan. The second modification we're going to talk about is adding new non-admin users, just as cached on hosts. And here what that looks like is we took that kind of starting example, just a bit of it, just for demonstration detail. And you can see in red, we've got user C, user A, and user B, just added as having active sessions on these hosts. It just, it doesn't change the topology at all. It's just an extra bit of information. And we can see Fast Downward. It doesn't really do much with the info. Same plan length, 3 seconds more. It's not a lot. But Probe takes 8 seconds longer. Same plan length, but that's like a 20% increase, which is pretty large. The third one, existing user cached on a random host. So here we're just going to say like, hey, here Pris is selected randomly and now has an active session on host 1. Doesn't really change the topology much at all. For some reason, Fast Downward just explodes here. We chose a host randomly. We're still trying to figure out exactly why it was doing that. But you can see the time on average was a little bit over 2 minutes with a standard deviation of 200 seconds. Whereas Probe, the time actually went down, which does make sense because you're going to cache more credentials. Number 4 is we're going to make an existing user an admin on a random host. So here we're just going to say Roy is now an admin on host 3. It'll give us a lateral chain from 2 to 3. Nothing too fancy, but when you put Fast Downward through it, you get maybe 1 second increase. You do get some standard deviation, a bit of a jump there, but not a huge change. And then for Probe, it gets a little bit slower. Again, you've got some deviation there, but really I'd say that this trial didn't have much of an impact on either planner. Now we get to some of the more fun ones. The first is adding a small disconnected network. So we're going to take this kind of start diagram and then move host 1 up. And then we've got host X added, who has admin user A and user B. Totally disconnected from the goal, totally disconnected from the rest of the network. But interestingly enough, it causes Fast Downward to basically double its total time and come up with a longer plan to solve this, which is fairly interesting. And Probe, it also causes a relatively significant increase. That's 15 seconds against 41. Unmodified. That's pretty good. Now it gets even more fun. We're going to add a medium disconnected network. And what's going on here is we're going to add 3 of these hosts, kind of in a little ring format where X gets to Y, gets to Z. Again, totally disconnected. It shouldn't really impact the actual path. Here now, the time for Fast Downward, it increases even more. 168 seconds now versus the 128 for the small disconnected network. Here we see, interestingly enough, the plan length is 26 as opposed to 28 for small disconnected network. Still trying to figure that one out too. And for Probe, we got nothing. Probe actually can't solve this. It crashes every single time we've tried to run the medium disconnected network case. And then second to last, we've got a medium connected network. And here it's kind of the same as before, where we're adding these 3 hosts, but now we're connecting it by saying that Rick is an admin on host X. So now there's a chain 1 to X to Y to Z. And interestingly, this, again, is still a slowdown for fast downward. Only 3 seconds more than disconnected, which is somewhat interesting. And probe can't even run it. And then the last one is something silly, just adding a bunch of new objects. And we're not going to connect them to anything, put any info in them. It's going to be, here's W, X, Y, Z, V, and a bunch of different users. It's very bland. It's not changing any topology. There's no topology whatsoever. And fast downward immediately recognizes this, basically no change on the total time for it to solve it. Whereas probe, this is actually probe's slowest trial that it actually completes, going from 41 seconds up to 74. So this causes a fairly significant slowdown for probe, which is fairly surprising given that fast downward looks at it and it's like, all right, I don't care, no big deal. So talking a little bit more about some of these results and why they happened, the planner performance varied. It's really interesting. Probe is really fast, but it struggles with grounding the problem. So if the problem's too big, it's going to struggle to kind of, actually solve it. Whereas fast downward, it's grounding it well, but it's slower to actually come up with the plan. So it's interesting to see those kind of varied approaches giving these varied results. We also saw that many of these one-off modifications that we did, they had inconsistent or little effect. Usually at least one of probe or fast downward could solve them easily, with some exceptions around like the medium and the small disconnected networks, and a couple of others we didn't talk too much about today. And probably most consistently, the most effective modification was indeed to add a fake network. Interestingly, connected versus disconnected didn't matter, but this was just, from a consistency perspective, just the most effective modification we could throw at the planner. So a few takeaways just from the experiments themselves. Given the differences in planner methodology, if you're thinking about or you're worried about automated planners attacking your network, your best bet from what we're seeing today is probably to bet on a portfolio of modifications. Probe just fell on its face by throwing noise at it, whereas fast downward just, breezed right through it. It's low cost to do that versus something higher cost like creating a whole nother network. Adding an additional network, that's likely the best way to slow down a planner based on these results. But this, of course, takes a lot more effort than just adding stuff in Active Directory willy-nilly, and it's a little bit more time-consuming. And what's interesting, too, is that things that might work against a human, overwhelming an adversary with objects, right, in the case of that last trial, that fast downward just breezed through, well, that's easy for some of the planners to solve. It isn't necessarily harder. A couple of notes on some future work we're hoping to do and some other interesting things that we found so far. First, we do want to expand our experiments. This is an active area of research we're trying to look into. We want to run more tests, more planner, more modifications, different assumptions about our attackers, different models. We also want to better understand why some of the planners struggle with some modifications. As I mentioned, we're still trying to figure out why, say, fast downward, when you did the random user cache somewhere, it just said, I give up. I'm going to take 2 minutes now. We still want to better understand why some of these trials cause such interesting results. We also want to target online planners that execute an action and then get a response and then maybe change their plan. That way we can do more live deceptions as opposed to just topology modification. And another big thing we're curious about is, how do we deceive today's automated adversaries? Deceiving automated planners is great, but it is a little bit far away. How would a simple automated adversary respond to deception? Can we break it? Can we force it down the wrong path? Can we build a detection and prevention mechanism? Can we do that easily to thwart them? And also, how would a simple adversary respond to some of our more interesting anti-planner deceptions? And real quickly, we actually have started a little bit down this path. We've run Caldera in some basic profiles to understand how some little deceptions might throw it off. And here's an example where we ran Caldera using this basic Alice 2.0 credential theft profile against 10 hosts set up so that there's only one real lateral movement path. And we did it in 2 trials, just one no deception and one that did fake credentials added to the starting host. And here's a little diagram, fairly straightforward. You can see we've got host 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. We start on 1, we go through the ring. It's fairly easy. This took Caldera unoptimized for speed, so not as quick as it could be, but it took it 23 minutes and it executed 122 actions. Then over here, we took the same network and just ran this cmd key command on that start1 host, and that added this fake user and password kind of credential combo. By running Caldera this way, it now took 29 minutes executing 131 actions. And 9 of those 9 extra actions all use the fake credentials. It was, and this is a fairly significant slowdown. 6 minutes and 9 extra things makes it easier for you to detect. And so our hope is that with more testing, we can better understand how Caldera can potentially be a stand-in for today's automated adversary. We also want to see if we can maybe make Caldera a little bit smarter so that it can be a stand-in for even smarter adversaries, and really allow us to better understand how to defend against both intelligent and unintelligent automated adversaries. So with that, a couple of quick takeaways. Automated planning is cool, but adversaries might think so too. Deception strategies versus humans might not be the most optimal strategies versus bots. Deception against automated adversaries is an untapped research area. We think there's lots of different subtopics you can get into. We're really only scratching the surface here and would encourage others to also start thinking about it as well. And then today, kind of these simple deceptions are good enough versus things like Caldera, but tomorrow that might not always be the case. So we do think that this is an important area of further research. And with that, we put our contact info here. You can feel free to send us an email. I'm on Twitter too. And thank you for listening.